All right. Welcome, everybody. It's a full house tonight. We really appreciate that you're here with us instead of out on this beautiful evening. We are all here together for the same thing, for a book talk with Henry Grabar. And I'll do a quick intro for Henry, and then we will kick right off into a whole bunch of questions I have for him. And we'll have time at the end for questions from you. So I'm excited for the rest of the conversation. Henry Grabar is a journalist in Boston. He's a staff writer at Slate, where he writes the Metropolis column, and his reporting has also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, 99% Invisible, and other publications. He was the author of Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World, and that's what we're all here to talk about tonight, and the editor of The Future of Transportation. His next book follows the construction of an apartment building, and you can follow his work through his newsletter, Ground Floor. My name is Melissa McMahon. I'm Parking and Curb Space Manager with Arlington County, and that's all you need to know about me. So Henry, what got you interested in parking of all things?
Well, Melissa, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Arlington Library for hosting me here. It's great to be here up on stage with you to talk about this, because sometimes when I go to places, people will pigeonhole me with questions about the specific parking meter rates at this specific intersection and why it looks like that. And today I can just say, I'm going to pass that off to you. Like Terry Gross was like, why is this garage like this? And I was like, I don't know. I've never been to Philadelphia. But parking. I think that I developed an interest in parking at a young age because I grew up in New York City, and I remember thinking when I went to other places in the United States, boy, there's a lot of parking lots here. And it was just this simple observation of why has so much land in our downtowns been dedicated to what seems to me like a suboptimal use of land. And it didn't really cross my mind that this was a field of serious inquiry until I read Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she has a chapter about border vacuums. And she describes parking lots as an example of a border vacuum that tend to suck the life out of the spaces around them. And that sort of planted a seed in my head that this might be something that might have some importance to it. And then later, when I began working as a journalist, I would write about all of these different topics in the American city, from the cost of housing to the way people got around to the environment. And it just seemed like under every topic, this subject kept coming up again and again. And then finally, I had a bit of a eureka moment when I went to Houston after Hurricane Harvey to report on the aftermath of that storm, which flooded more than 100,000 homes in and around Harris County. And one of the things that I learned from people there was that they felt that their houses had flooded not according to the FEMA flood maps, but according to patterns of development around them. And I had this dawning awareness that the entire metropolis was not, in fact, built upon these sort of natural undulations in the landscape, but was very much, at least as far as stormwater was concerned, a product of these actual decisions about where the pavement was and how big the sewers were, and that we were living in this vast man-made landscape, of which parking turned out to be a major component. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for that overview. So heading into this book, I wanted to observe that I felt as a reader that your book was a really interesting combination of literature review from a sense of the research, the clear research that was done, case studies that brought you into the lives of real people, and interviews with real people, and plenty of quotes, so I could see the journalism, right, through and through. But there's so much out there you could have done such interviews in pretty much any town or city in the whole U.S. So can you talk a little bit about how you tackled scoping this work, deciding who to feature, who to talk to, where to be, in order to put the story together?
Such a good question. Thank you. I think everybody who undertakes a book project of any kind at a certain point has to say, okay, I've gotten the best stories that I can get. And that was particularly difficult here because sometimes you meet somebody and they tell you a great story about how they had a fight over a parking space or something like that, and you just wonder, like, boy, that's pretty good, but if I just talked to a few more people, maybe I could get something better. And I think when I started working on the book, I initially had the idea that maybe this entire book could be set in one city and would have this kind of Aristotelian unity of place that would enable you to really follow the kind of a particular place and a particular set of characters through basically the history of American urban development into, from the kind of bustling city of the early 20th century to the hollowed out city of the late 20th century to whatever sort of, wherever we're at now on the rebound on that trajectory. But I also felt that I had an obligation to find the best stories from each of these different sort of urban studies subjects with which parking intersects. So that ultimately led me to make the decision that I needed to jump around. And I guess the advantage of that is that I was able to include stories from a bunch of different places, and I hope that resonates with people. Because even if they can't relate to the part of the book that's about Chicago, maybe they can relate to the part that's about Los Angeles or New York, or of course Arlington makes an appearance as well. So I think that was an editorial choice, and I still wonder what it would be like to really focus on one place and try and go block by block and figure out how each building in the downtown found its way into being a pile of rubble and then eventually an asphalt parking lot. But it turns out I think that's just a book for someone else to write.
So you talked about how you set aside the one city story for looking at these urban studies, urban topics. And it was clear, the book is laid out this way in many respects, that you do hit on several urban topics that touch on parking or parking touches on them. For me in this industry, I feel like my brain goes back to the chicken and the egg problem when it comes to parking. And I tie that in because we manage parking on the street today. That's what my team does. We basically manage a thing that's already out there. But Arlington also shapes the built environment, and we are shaped, our decisions are shaped by the built environment. So there's the sense of opportunity that policy can change things, and there's the sense that we also have to work with what we have. And a lot of our conversations with community members are grappling with that nexus. Can you talk a little bit about land use and some of these key management needs and challenges, like the bigger picture story frame, and how parking is getting in the way or helping or really shaping the way that we make decisions in those areas?
Yeah. So I think one way to approach this question is to think about the historical development of the automobile. And, the Model T rolls off the line in the first decade of the 20th century. And basically we see enormous growth in vehicle ownership in the United States clean through the 20th century, right? But I think one thing that they didn't anticipate was dealing with the parking problem. And in fact, we watch as municipal leaders in the United States grapple with how they're going to solve this parking problem, which, believe it or not, is considered to be the subject of the prime subject of determining the fate of American cities in the late 1940s and 50s as the sort of urban development, urban renewal machine sort of revs up after the end of the Second World War. And I think this was quite shocking to me, given all the other issues that we were dealing with in American cities at that time. But I found this cartoon in the Los Angeles Times that shows this kind of King Kong style gorilla hulking over downtown Los Angeles, and he's labeled the downtown parking problem. And so I think this expresses the way that people thought about this, and they really thought that Shortage of parking was at the root of the traffic problem, and so to the extent that American cities needed to solve the traffic problem, it was really about solving the parking problem. And it was also at the root of the fight against suburbanization, or as they called it, decentralization. And the idea was that if American cities were going to successfully compete with the suburbs for jobs, for shopping, and for residents, that they were going to need to provide the kind of parking experience that Americans were getting in the suburbs of those cities. And so you see this kind of land use arms race begin to take shape as parking requirements are incorporated into city codes. And what that means is in every zoning code in the United States, pretty much, there's a section that says that this land use, whether it's a restaurant or an office or an apartment building, has to come with X number of parking spaces. And that figure might be correlated with the number of beds in a nursing home, or the number of lanes in a bowling alley, or the number of viewing rooms in a funeral parlor. It's quite arbitrary, and at the same time, completely pervasive. And so as far as the land use goes, we wind up in this situation where parking gets baked into the zoning code in just about every jurisdiction. And as I think we are all now reckoning with, this proves to be a self-perpetuating decision where if you create all of this free parking and you create the expectation of parking, you wind up with an urban environment that loses its ability to have a sufficient density to enable public transit, to enable walking, to enable biking, not just because of the subsidy that's been provided for cars, but also from a purely geometric perspective, because you have literally devoted so much land to the storage of cars. For example, a fast food joint might require a parking space for every 100 square feet of restaurant area in a city code. And because a parking space takes about 300 square feet, you do the math. 100 square feet of restaurant triggers 300 square feet of parking. If you think about the percentage of your land that's being dedicated to like actual human activity versus storing cars, you very quickly wind up in a situation where your city is more than half car storage, at least in terms of the stuff that's being developed and has been developed since the 1950s. So that's where we wound up. And obviously for transportation, that puts us in a bit of a difficult situation.
Is there a Goldilocks amount of parking for things? I mean, because if you know, tell me, because they want me to know.
The standard that people have for parking is it should be free, it should be convenient, ideally right in front of the front door of my destination or in front of my house, and it should be available the moment that I arrive. So that's really the sweet spot, and that's what's driven American urban planning for the last 75 years. We haven't gotten there yet, but maybe just one more parking lot.
I deserve that. I deserve that answer. Okay, thank you.
But I do. I mean, to more seriously answer that question, I think it is very challenging because there is no amount of parking that will satisfy everybody. Because as soon as you begin to restrict parking, you'll have people make different decisions about how to get around, right? And so the idea that you can provide the right amount of parking is like, as I say in the book, it's sort of like providing the right amount of beer at a high school party. You know, it'll just, whatever amount you've provided will no longer, will all be used up. And that's true of parking also. And that's because, right, parking it's not just, so I think urban planners at mid-century thought, there is a fixed demand, and if we adjust our supply to meet that demand, then we'll take care of the parking problem. Turns out that's not the way it works. The more parking you provide, the more you incentivize people to drive. And in fact, pretty much the only thing, given the rate of car ownership in this country, pretty much the only thing that discourages people from driving and from using their cars at every possible moment is the limitation on parking. And so if you look, people talk about, if you look at like correlations with transit ridership, with car ownership, with walking and biking, limitations on parking drive all those things. And sometimes in urban development conversations, you hear people say, well, you can't restrict the parking here because you haven't provided a sufficiently robust transit network for people to get around. But the reality is nobody's going to use transit if it's still easy and free to park. The thing that drives people to take the trouble of walking somewhere and getting on a train with a bunch of people and then walking to their destination is the fact that the parking is limited. So I think, which is why, I mean, you know, you're all here, so I don't need to tell you, but I think this is why parking is such an important and overlooked feature of the urban environment, not just because it responds to demand, because it has this power to shape people's travel choices. There
are two stories I wanna reach into your book about. The first one relates to enforcement. And my team doesn't do any enforcement directly, so don't ask me to validate any tickets or whatever they call that, waive any tickets. But your storytelling takes us to the streets with Anna Rusi, and she's a parking enforcement officer, and what it means to try to make people follow the rules when they park. And we know from our own data that many, many people, over half of those who park, don't pay when they're supposed to. That's just here in Arlington where we have sensors. And what's the enforcement story from your perspective, and what should we be thinking about to do it better?
Well, I usually like to talk about the development of the parking meter and just correct a common misconception about this, because I think AAA has long tried to convince people that the parking meter is a device to extract as much money from the motorist as possible. And it has wound up being used that way in some places. But as it was originally developed, it was a device for managing this precious interface between transportation and land use, between the street and the building. And this space, which is limited in all our cities, right? And it's the place where everybody wants to park. Everybody would rather park at the curb than in a garage. And so you need a system to distribute this very limited resource. And you can't build more curbs. Maybe you could build like a Parisian-style boulevard with some tree medians and sneakily get a couple lanes of parking in there, but really you're limited. And so this is how the parking meter gets developed in the 1930s. Urban planners grappling with this abundance of cars on the street think it just works miracles. They just cannot believe how it establishes order, pushes the all-day parkers, the 9-to-5 workers to parking spaces that are a little further away, and it leaves those metered spaces available for people who are parked for a shorter amount of time or who are willing to pay for the privilege of walking just a few feet to their destination. Unfortunately, as time goes on, people get very angry with these meters, and cities stop really keeping up their system of basically good meter policy, right? And a good meter policy should have a parking meter rate that's high enough that it creates free spots. If you don't create any empty spots on the block, then your meter is not functioning properly and you're not actually creating utility for people. And so this causes an illegal parking problem. And because cities were so reluctant to raise their meter rates, because this becomes a political football, you wound up with a situation where in cities like New York City, and this is probably even still true today, you're making more money from parking enforcement, from issuing tickets, than you are from the revenue from the meters. So it's as if the US government were making more money prosecuting people for tax fraud than from people paying their taxes. It's not how you want to design a system. And that's how many cities wound up with this system where they're super reliant on enforcement for revenue rather than using their meters effectively. And so I think people have come to see parking enforcement as a sort of a gotcha, and distrust meters and distrust city planners, no offense, for supervising the system that they don't see as working for them and is creating places for them to park. So I think that's a misconception that we're just starting to correct. And part of the issue too is then you have police departments engaging in, revenue-driven policing, where they say, we can find ways to basically try and extract fines from citizens, and parking violations are an easy way to do that, and an easy way to, give the police an excuse to go around and sort of inspect people's cars and check their registrations and so on and so forth. So I think there's definitely a process of repairing trust that needs to happen to restore people's faith in what is ultimately an urban management tool.
The other story that I want you to tell us a little bit more about is Chicago's really sad story. And listen to that. That means a lot of people read your book. Please, because this is right up the alley of why do we have meters and what happens and
Yes.
how do we manage our curb.
So Chicago was dealing with a situation similar to the one I just described, where they had not raised their parking meter rates in 40 years. And so people were going around with, sawed-off milk jugs full of quarters so that they could pay these meters all day. And by the way, if you haven't spent any time in Chicago, I think it's worth just a small digression into the practice, the culture of parking there, where they have these snowstorms in the winter, and then people shovel out the spots in front of their houses, and they reserve them with an object, which they call the dibs system. And so if you walk around Chicago after a snowy day in one of the neighborhoods, you will see all manner of household objects arrayed in the street. And I always imagine the implication is that whatever object it is, like a shovel or a lawn chair or a nativity figurine, the implication is you would be beaten with this object if you were to take that parking space. So this just illustrates the way that Chicagoans think about their parking. And with that in mind, consider that they had not changed these meter rates in 50 years. And as the financial crisis begins to dawn in 2008, the mayor, Richard Daley, is approached by the bankers at Morgan Stanley who pitch him on this idea that he could privatize the city's 35,000 parking meters. Never been done before, but Daley had made something of a name for himself in pioneering privatization in various aspects of city management. And I think this is not to say privatization never makes sense. You wouldn't want a city government running, a power plant, or even recycling can be very challenging. But parking meters, it's not rocket science. So they pitched this. Chicago put this out for bids. How much would people want to pay for the right to run their 35,000 parking meters for 75 years? And Morgan Stanley submitted a bid of over $1 billion. And I think the city council in Chicago, the aldermen, were quite floored by this figure. They thought, how could anybody possibly be offering us this much money? They signed the deal. They accepted the $1 billion. Morgan Stanley predictably raised the parking meter rates immediately. And turns out those parking meters were worth a lot more than the city had calculated. And the sad part of it is that Morgan Stanley made their money back in 10, 12 years maybe, because they had raised those parking meter rates so quickly and revealed the true willingness to pay for parking in Chicago, that people actually placed a great deal of value on being able to park right in front of their destination. And the sad thing is that this deal is, I think it's got another, 54, 53 years to go. And all that money from all that parking revenue in Chicago is just going to these investors in this deal rather than funding city services and improvements on the street.
And what do they do if they want to change what's on the street to support the community?
Oh, right. And then there's that's the additional tragedy, is that if Chicago wants to do any projects on the street, they want to have a parade, they want to build a bike lane, there's a construction project, and a meter has to go out of commission, then the city needs to pay this private consortium of investors for the right to remove this meter from the city streets. So I would say that is a cautionary tale about not understanding the value of parking and the public's willingness to pay for it sometimes.
I will scratch that idea off my list. Arlington gets a small mention in your book. Woo woo. As the test case for residential permit parking that got taken all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. I get to say that sometimes in community conversations, which is really exciting. The U.S. Supreme Court. It remains a sensitive topic for residents, though, for sure, and for staff and elected officials to this day. Why does the parking space in front of our homes feel so personal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I was talking earlier to Nate, who works on parking policy here, and he was saying that they did a study of the residential permit districts in Arlington, and Donald Shoup, the late great scholar of parking studies, used to say that you'd really want every block to be 85% full, because at 85% full, you're making the most of your urban real estate. and the access that the curb provides, but you're also making sure that there's a spot available, and so people don't have to drive around the block endlessly looking for parking. And what Arlington found when they did this study of the residential permit districts is that when the block gets to be 50% full, people register that as full. So 50% occupancy means, okay, there's too many cars parked on this block. Now, maybe that's a skills issue. In terms of parallel parking, backing in, obviously it's better to just be able to drive into that thing. But at the same time, I think what we're dealing with in a lot of places is the reality that residents' concern over parking and the availability of parking is a major factor in saying no to new residential development. Now, that's not a problem that Arlington has. This place is practically the national poster child for YIMBYism. So not a problem here, but in a lot of communities, you do get, okay, some dispute about that. To my eyes, there's quite a bit of development that's happened here. But in a lot of places, I really think that the availability of parking is a driving factor in people saying no to new neighbors. And you see this in surveys sometimes where people will say, what is your primary concern about having a new apartment building here, about new people moving to this block? It's not that there will be too many people on the soccer field, or that the sidewalks will be too busy, or that there'll be too many people at the restaurant or the grocery store. It's that people are going to compete for my parking space. And so to the extent that we can begin to diffuse that conflict, then that is very good news. And something you see in places, which I don't know if I would endorse, but it illustrates the kind of realpolitik of this particular issue, is the idea that we can approve new apartment buildings, but deny the residents of those buildings the right to park on the street. And so we create a kind of two-tiered system of who has a right to public space, where the people who've lived, or it's not even how long you've lived here, it's what address you live in would entitle you to park your car on the curb. Whereas if you live in a new building, this is the case, for example, in Cambridge and Somerville in Boston, if you live in one of these buildings that's been built more recently without parking, then just by living at that address, you forfeit your right to have a say at the curb. And the idea is that this enables this higher density development to occur by allowing, by sort of taking neighbors out of this competition. But I agree with you that this is a real phenomenon, and I would say a relatively toxic development, because often the people who are most attached to those curb spaces are the folks who do not have parking spaces of their own in their own units. And so the idea that those people got the right to live, they had the opportunity to buy or rent a unit that was built without a parking space, which costs a lot less than building with a parking space. And then they took advantage of this public resource, and they would like to deny future residents the ability to do the same. That doesn't seem fair to me.
Yeah, it's a real stumper, I'll just say. This is not a fun balancing act to do. With respect to our metered parking, we also know we don't have, like as you put it earlier, we can't promise you that there's going to be a space for you in front of exactly where you're going when you want to be there for free, right? So we can't get all of those things at once. And through the pilot project we've been doing, and thanks everyone who spent some time at our open house up there to learn more about it, to engage with us about it, we have a bit of a truism we're learning about metered parking in particular, and that's that no one thinks about parking until they need it, like right in that second. But in our project, we've developed apps to help you find it. We've got Park Mobile, which is an app to help you pay for it. You can know exactly where it's available in that moment in time, and an app can even navigate you to available open space today in our metered corridors. But people aren't yet really taking this up. So tell me, because you're a journalist and you've talked to everyone in the country about things, what is it going to take for people to think about where they want to park in advance of getting to the neighborhood? What does it take?
I would say that's one of the great mysteries of parking, is why this remains such an afterthought for people. I think it's partly because for people, I mean, now we've had driving directions for probably 15, 20 years where you can just very quickly look something up on your phone and find the exact directions to get there. And it does take a little bit of the kind of the thought process out of how you get from A to B. And then when you arrive there, parking hits you like a ton of bricks. It's just something that wasn't included in that time estimate. And so I think this is one of the reasons that people get so emotional about it, is that it feels like a trick that's been played on you at the end of your trip, where you've gotten to where you're going, and then all of a sudden you find you can't get out of the car. Now, as far as why people don't make plans in advance, I think it's because it's just there is no system to reserve something, and there's no way to know for sure. I mean, maybe with your system, you do have a little bit more a sense of what might be available, but most of the time there's no way to know for sure exactly what's going to be available. And so it does force us to think on our feet a little bit, and I think everybody has their own strategy for how they're going to go about leaving that car behind when they get where they're going. Now, so I mentioned earlier that I grew up in New York City, so I have a kind of like parking PTSD that I carry around with me, where like we'll be going to the grocery store, and I'll pull in and I'll just like park at the first spot. Like I don't want to like look around, because I just feel like if I see a spot, then that's what I'm going to take. But obviously, there's other people who they want the good spot, they want the perfect spot, and they'll circle the block for a while. So we've all got our own ways of doing this, but I think what you're offering here sounds like that's a pretty novel thing for people to be able to actually see which parking space is available before they leave their house.
So try it out. Sorry, I've got to make some of these plugs for the project, right? That's the only reason I'm up here. You and I have spent far more time thinking about parking than the average person. And none of you are average because you're here with us. What is one or perhaps two key things you wish everyone knew about parking that are takeaways from your work on this book?
Well, the first one has to be how much parking costs to build. We all know how much it costs to use, mostly nothing, especially if you don't pay for the parking meter, as many people in Arlington apparently don't. But providing parking is very expensive, and so I think going back again to this history of the development of the American city, there's this idea that we can zone for parking and solve our parking problem. Because as the urban environment changes, as spaces turn over into new uses, as buildings get built, all of the parking we need will be included at every site. And that's a very pretty picture to paint, but when you come to actually building something, you find that parking is incredibly expensive to build. So I mentioned earlier the case of a fast food restaurant where perhaps 75% of the parcel is devoted to surface parking. That's one way to do it. The other way, obviously, is if you want to use your entire property to build a structured garage or to build that parking underground. In the book, I mentioned that the lead designer of SimCity, when he was trying to model the urban environment, was quite shocked at how much parking there was and thought, if I replicate this amount of parking in this game, it will be boring and ugly. So I will pretend in the game that the parking is all underground. Now, the reality of building parking underground is that it costs $100,000 a space. So if you want to build an apartment building in Arlington and you have this idea that, well, the law should require 2 parking spaces for every unit because we think the inhabitants are going to come with cars, we don't want them parking them on the street, and so we're going to require this. If that parking gets built underground, you are putting a $200,000 tax on every single unit that hits the market. And then people wonder why housing is so expensive. It's a little bit cheaper if you build that parking in structured parking above ground, but could still cost $50,000, $60,000 a space. And it's a significant amount of money, in particular for affordable housing projects, for senior housing, for some of these lower margin projects that have greater social utility. And I think one of the saddest things about working on this book, you mentioned earlier, like, how did I find people's stories? How did I decide? I think one great thing about this is once you put up the flag that says, I'm interested in parking, people come out of the woodwork, Because it's like, they feel like they've found just finally somebody to listen to them. And in Austin, I got a tour of a housing complex that had been built for formerly homeless veterans. And they had been required to include 1 parking space for every unit. Now, these people didn't have cars. They didn't have homes. And this parking garage was basically entirely empty all day long. And the developer of the project was like, look at this. This is actual money and actual space that could have been dedicated to more apartments to get people off the street. And now it's an empty parking garage because that's what was required by law.
So what's your second takeaway?
Oh, sorry.
I'm making you work for it.
Second takeaway. I want to go back to parking and its effect on the environment. I mean, I feel like this is like one of those ideas that you have when you're a kid where you're like, ooh, parking space, like bad, cut down trees. And then you get to be an adult and you're like, no, parking space is good because, well, it's hard for me to say exactly how this line of thinking emerged, but I think basically people have an idea that this American suburban style development is green because there are lawns and there are trees. But of course, this requires everybody to drive everywhere. And the country's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions is from transportation. And so if you're building this way, you are building in this enormous environmental cost. And when it comes to parking lots, I feel like we're only beginning to really understand the way that they affect, I would say, the urban heat island effect, and also stormwater flooding, which feels like it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And if you're basically requiring that, you know, the studies show that, say, in the Bay Area, 14% of the land is parking. And this is the most expensive place in the entire United States, and 14% of the entire urban agglomeration is parking spaces. That's a really significant piece of what you're thinking about when you think about the city. And it has enormous consequences on the way that our cities interact with heat, with water, with native species, and everything else.
This is the point in the evening where I turn to you for questions. I've exhausted my pre-prepared ones. Would anyone like to start? Excellent, excellent. All right, we've got a traveling microphone, and I don't know how you're going to pick.
I was going to have you pick, Melissa. All right, I
Okay.
saw this hand go up first, but I'm going to see if I can
Okay.
sneak through here.
I saw your hand too. Okay.
Yes, thank you again for your talk. I appreciate it. Both of you. Even you. Oh, you are important too. I just have a quick story, and don't worry, I'm not going to monologue, I swear. I live in a mixed-use, an apartment in Arlington with a neighborhood that has garden-style apartments, townhomes, high-rises, single-family homes. But it's not zoned, and something I've noticed in the past year is parking is very hard to find at night, and I'm starting to think maybe we just need to zone it. But what I'm hearing from you is trying to address supply and demand and therefore make parking more convenient the right way to think about it, or is there a different way to look at that issue?
When you say zone, you mean like a residential parking permit system? Yeah, I mean, I think once people have purchased cars, it's very difficult to come up with a parking policy that's going to make them sell those cars. And so one of the things that Arlington has going for it is lots of people move here every year, and so you have a chance to get them at this moment of, a big life change where they're making decisions about how they're going to get around, where they're going to live, how many vehicles they're going to have in each household. And so to the extent that the parking policy sets the tone for that and says, you know what, you're not going to be able to just park 3 cars on the street here for free, then that is probably a positive development in terms of creating, encouraging lower rates of car ownership, which in turn creates less traffic for everybody who actually needs a car to get around, right? And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here. I think the hope on the part of planners, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's not that we want everybody to get rid of their cars at once, but that some trips need to be made by car. And those trips are getting increasingly difficult to make by car as the roads are flooded with other vehicle trips. And I think this is one of the lessons from New York City's congestion pricing pilot, is that the city found that ambulance rides, police responses, fire, buses, all of these essential functions of the city, to say nothing of just like making commercial deliveries, were becoming impossible because there was so much traffic. And it turns out that a lot of that traffic was from, discretionary car trips that people were making because access to the road was free. And so I think, yes, I mean, I don't know your neighborhood in particular, but I think establishing a permit program, beginning to think about pricing, how many vehicles per household can be parked on the street, those are all ways of dealing with that issue for sure.
Yeah.
Well, no, the question that I have is, why zone some areas and not others? It seems like everyone should have access to the public street. So that, if you force people to do that, and neighborhoods don't have, zoned areas where they don't allow people to park on the side of the street, then it allows everyone freedom to park there, if they plan ahead or whatnot. And it doesn't sort of create the system where the wealthy neighborhoods can keep people out because they feel like they own every street within their neighborhood. It seems not fair.
That's a very good observation, and in fact, in many places where there are residential parking permits, blame Arlington for that development, see the Supreme Court decision. In many cities where there are these permit zones, we find that there's a kind of prisoner's dilemma that ensues where once one neighborhood has decided we're going to restrict our parking to residents only, then there's spillover parking in the neighborhoods that haven't yet established a permit system, and so they're incentivized to come up with something. And then before long, you wind up in a situation where you have some neighborhoods or even commercial areas that are very, very congested, and then you might even go 2 blocks, and there'll be a neighborhood where there's tons of space on the curb because there's a very restrictive permit system in place. And so that's certainly one way to do it, but if you're thinking about curb parking as a public resource that you want to maximize the value of that, maybe you want to think about, could there be exceptions to those permits, right? Like, could we establish a system where it's a permit system, but, other people can park there during the day, right? Like employees of local businesses or something like that, so.
All right, I saw this guy over here.
Appreciate your comments and your perspectives on parking. I will offer parking is just one of the many tools that are available in the management toolbox that a city, county, community, state has to manage the use of public right-of-way and travel. I would offer, having done transportation planning for over 39 years, typically it's the travel time reliability, and the total cost of a trip that's going to influence choice, either the route, time of departure, or the mode or the route that they're going to take. All right, so offering parking and having parking available, yeah, that's one of the things, but it's just one of the tools in the toolbox. So if you're looking at parking as the sole arbiter of influencing trip choice, I would beg to differ on some of your postulates that you offered in your remarks today. As an example, there's been a lot of work around the country on why you have certain amount of parking for types of businesses, right, that go with zoning, because it's based on research. People go out of business with businesses that don't have parking. Yeah, and there's an expectation on the impact that a development is going to have on the transportation, right? If you don't have parking, people are going to park somewhere, and that's a public responsibility to take that into account.
Perhaps.
So I would also go back to, and it goes back to the larger picture of Arlington. They're looking at their transportation plan. You've got, transportation analysis zones, employment, housing, right, and population, and that drives where people work and what their travel time is and what modes and routes they're going to take. And parking is just one of the many parts in the process. So it should be based on science, not on emotion. Thank you.
Yeah, I I agree that parking is only one of many factors that determine how people are going to get around. And I think what makes it so important is that we are so reluctant to come up with any other way of managing automobile use. So it's very difficult. New York City is the only place in the country that's managed to establish this kind of tolling paradigm around the center city. In terms of finding a replacement for the gas tax as electric vehicles take off, that seems very complicated. Finding other ways to make people pay for vehicle use is really challenging. And so parking kind of serves this role as being one way to regulate that. And then in terms of businesses and the idea that businesses will go out of business if they don't have enough parking, or that you could make this extend that to the question of housing, right? Like who's gonna buy an apartment if it doesn't come with a parking space, or who wants to rent an apartment in a building without a parking space? I think the argument that gets made now is you should let the business owner or the developer of that building take that risk if they feel comfortable taking that risk. And if they blow it and their business fails, or the apartments in that building wind up renting for less than they hoped they would, well, then that is not always a public policy failure, in particular if the rents wind up being lower than people thought.
I'm gonna move around. I'm making my way around here, so next question.
Oh, I was going to do a question up here, but that's okay. I'll do the next one. I'm also wandering, since you guys don't want to hear from me.
Hi, I was just wondering, with your Chicago parking example, do you think that there's any chance that the city could not have politically done the price increase that the private entity was able to do? Like you had mentioned, parking can be a bit of a political football. So like, is there a counterfactual where the city tries that on their own and gets like complete public backlash because it's seen as like a city cash grab as opposed to a private cash grab, which people seem to be cool with?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I mean, the evil genius of this plan was that they sold the parking meters for, $1 billion plus, and then they immediately spent all that money avoiding a property tax increase. And so by the time that it dawned on them that this was a very toxic situation, they weren't going to be able to raise a bunch of money to buy back the meters. And they tried to argue their way out of it. But ultimately, you're right that it would have been very challenging for the Chicago City Council to pass these raise the meter rates on their own and generate this revenue and not get booted out of office. But of course, cities have methods for doing this, right? You can bond against future revenue, and you can sort of lock up that revenue in those bond contracts. And so I think there are ways to make changes that can't be just immediately undone if you get thrown out of office. I mean, you might get thrown out of office, but that's actually what happened. I mean, Richard Daley, I mean, he didn't run again for various reasons, but it did become a part of his legacy. And so the idea that it's not like they escaped the consequences of this deal at any rate.
How does rideshare change some of the dynamic around parking? For instance, you mentioned the place in Cambridge that said, okay, nobody is allowed to have a car, and how expensive it is to have, $200,000 for 2 spaces underground. What if you said to a developer, okay, you can't have parking, but we're going to give each person in that apartment, instead of a $200,000 space, we'll give you a $10,000 credit for rideshare?
It's a great question. I think when Uber and Lyft really took off about 15 years ago, there were high hopes that these services would make a dent in car ownership and car use. The reality is that hasn't happened, and there seems to be just more traffic than ever. If anything, it feels like those services compete mostly with transit, biking, and walking, rather than replacing car ownership, except perhaps for trips to the bar, which is good. But it doesn't solve this larger land use problem. I think rideshare was a very promising alternative that unfortunately did not take off in the way many people were hoping, in part because it was competing with these venture capital funded subsidized services like Uber and Lyft. And I remember 10 years ago, you could get a Zip car or whatever and drive it to the grocery store, but it was just cheaper to take an Uber there and back. And so why would you, use that service? That's not really the case anymore. But rideshare has, struggled to get off the ground. I think what you're seeing now is individual rideshare systems being deployed for specific buildings. It's basically exactly what you're describing, where I think they've realized that in terms of the insurance costs and perhaps people's desire to use the system and faith in the system, it's more difficult to share a car with an entire city, and it's a little easier to share that car with just people who live in your building. So I am seeing developers begin to develop these kinds of systems as a way of defraying those parking costs, but still providing automobiles to people who need them.
Great. We got a question here in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, and I confess I haven't read your book, but questions about the 300 square feet per parking space starts with an assumption about the size of an American car, which is grossly oversized for its utility in an urban context. So I'm curious, obviously Fiat wouldn't have developed a Cinquecento or the Fiat 500 to fit into a human scale.
That's my car.
Medieval city. Or a Japanese K car, or a Chinese city car, or a golf cart in the villages in Florida. I mean, do you see any American cities, and Arlington, likes to be on the cutting edge, creating, small parking spots perpendicular to the curb for cars, to favor low-speed vehicles, if you can't wean Americans off their cars, at least move them to an urban scale car. They would also be safer for pedestrians and bicyclists if you had a collision. So that's my question.
In a word, no. But, maybe it's something to think about.
I'll put it on my list. I took that other thing off my list, but I'll put that one on.
I think, yeah, right. It is obviously a huge issue, no pun intended, that cars have become so large for reasons that go well beyond parking. But again, the place that actually does do the thing you're talking about is commercial garages, where they will sometimes have special rates for small cars based on whatever the weird geometry they have around their columns. But I haven't seen any cities, at least in North America, adopt that. Paris does now have a special parking rate for SUVs, although only for SUVs driven in from out of town. Residents with their SUVs still pay the same rate.
All right, go on with.
So it seems as communities start to densify and there's more business and more people, the ones that are successful are considered 24 hours. There's people around all the time. Have you had any experience, or do you have any stories to share with us about shared parking? That a movie theater doesn't need their spaces during the day, and shopping, grocery stores don't necessarily need their spaces at night.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think that is one of the responses to the parking requirement situation. One of the reasons that requiring parking as part of the zoning with every use doesn't work that well is if you need to go from the dentist to the sandwich shop, you are actually required to move your car from one business's parking lot to the next. And so that's one of the reasons that these rules reinforce automobility, right? Because you actually can't just park once and then access all the things in the community. And so the situation you're describing, in which you have a parking lot or a garage that might be shared between different uses, is very nearly the utility that people find in parking at the curb, right? I mean, that's what a curb is. It's a shared parking resource that can serve all manner of uses. And so you can park once and then go do whatever you need to do, and it serves different people at different times of day and different businesses. And so I think in terms of developing that in private parking lots, there are two challenges, and the first one is in city code. Are you going to permit the movie theater to share those parking spaces with the elementary school or whatever? That's maybe the easy part. And then the other part of it is negotiating contracts between those different businesses. Like, who's undertaking that work? Because it's probably not like, somebody opening a bar might not. When would it come up in the process that they would go to the elementary school and say, hey, can we use your parking lot after night? So, or during the night. So I think this is often something that requires a very active role on the part of city planners, at least for existing uses, to go into people and say, hey, we noticed your parking lot is empty all night. Like, would you be willing to share it with somebody? But certainly lots of potential there.
Thanks. Two questions, one for Henry, one quick one for Melissa. Henry, for you, with the advent of electric vehicles, have you seen, or in your research, did you address at all the addition of charging capability to parking lots. And for Melissa, just a quickie, you mentioned that 50% of people in Arlington violate parking meter restrictions. Does that include expired meters, or is that literally people who don't pay at all up front? Just curious.
It constitutes, the way we do the calculation is we look at parking instances in the space, or the small set of spaces on the curb, and we compare that to the number of transactions that are happening on that curb. So it has nothing to do with citations, and it doesn't have anything to do with how long people stay. It's just how many cars parked there and how many payments were made there. And we're averaging 35% across our entire metered, censored network. Yep. People are not paying. Yeah.
I mean, it is a self-perpetuating cycle when you have these, people don't pay, and so the fines, and there's not a lot of enforcement generally, hence the reason people don't pay, and so as a result, the fines have to be high to have any kind of deterrent effect. And then anytime you get caught, you feel like you've really gotten taken advantage of with this ridiculous fine. To answer your question about electric vehicles, yes, and it's a really challenging situation because electric vehicle adoption is highly dependent on whether people have a space to charge, a dedicated space to charge that vehicle. It's hard to convince people that they're going to make this big investment. They don't know how they're going to fuel their vehicle reliably. And so in places like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, any really big city where lots of people park on the street, you need a way to assure that we're not going to get left out of the EV transition and wind up being these sort of islands of fossil fuel mobility surrounded by people who have chargers in their garages. And providing those chargers is really hard, right? It's really expensive to dig up the curb and install the charger. And what I've heard from developers of multifamily housing is that retrofitting a 60s condo building with a bunch of EV chargers in the garage is a nightmare. You have to change the whole building's electrical supply. You have to dig up all the foundation, install this stuff, change the fireproofing. It sounds really, really challenging. And so I think my hope is that EV charging advances in speed. And so you wind up with a situation where we can sort of imitate the network of gas stations that we've built out. And EV charging will become something you can do in that way, because I don't think we're ever going to be able to just electrify the entire parking stock that we have now. Too expensive.
All right, we have time for one more question, and then we will adjourn.
I have a question for both of you. Could you come up with a couple of examples of, innovative parking ideas? Like, let me ask the county, have you started like some congestion parking pricing, I believe? It's piloted?
Yes, so the pilot that we have information here tonight at the back of the house is what we call performance parking. And what it has done is put sensors in about 4,500 metered parking spaces in our Roslyn, Ballston, and Crystal City, Pentagon City, Potomac Yard corridors. And we've used the sensors to understand occupancy and use. And then we've adjusted prices according to demand. So where the use has been up over 80, sometimes 90 or more % busy, we've raised the price incrementally on a quarterly basis for the last year and a half. And where parking spaces are underutilized, and we used roughly a threshold of 40% or less, we started decreasing the price. So today on the street, you've got a wide array of prices, and we've got information on the tools we have available today to actually show you what that price profile is, where you can park for cheaply, where it's more expensive, but also how it varies by time of day, and ways for you to more quickly understand whether parking is going to be available where you're going. Your turn.
Oh boy, I mean, I think everyone loves to think about, what if we had an entire parking garage that was run by robots? Or what if we, and the truth is, this is not a field that demands a lot of innovation. A lot of what needs to happen is just really simple, basic management strategies. I think we're beginning to repair the mistake that we made at mid-century, which was building in car ownership as a requirement of every single land use as an expectation and a cost that was just going to be part of the way the environment was built. And so simply correcting that mistake is the thing that's happening now. You're beginning to see large cities like Austin, Texas, San Jose do away with zoning for parking. Various states like California and Oregon have come up with similar basically rules that restrict the ability of cities to require parking. And then obviously you're seeing more and more communities say, you know what, nobody likes free parking. Nobody likes paying for parking. But we do recognize that what people perhaps dislike more than paying for parking is the consequences of an unregulated free parking stock, which is people circling the block, limitations on the ability of people to open new businesses or new people to move in. And so you are beginning to see some of these really basic changes. But I think that's what makes parking policy appealing to people, is that it's something that feels very tangible, like something that we can actually change in an urban policy environment where it feels like so much is out of our control, requires some kind of federal intervention passed by Congress, yada, yada, yada. The parking, as you've demonstrated here in Arlington, is something you can just mess with month by month and experiment with until you get it right. And I think that's appealing.
Thank you so much, Henry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Melissa.